Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I'm Lynette Clementson. I'm director of Wallace House here at the university. We have two programs, the Knight Wallace Fellowships for Journalists and the Livingston Awards for Young Journalists. And welcome to our second annual Eisendrath Symposium. It gives me great pleasure to say that, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the Eisendrath Symposium in a moment. I want to thank our partners in this effort today, Michigan Radio and the Knight Foundation. Michigan Radio, of course, you know well. The Knight Foundation supports a wide range of journalism organizations and efforts across the country, and they are a supporter of Wallace House and specifically helped us to start this symposium. And so we want to thank them. And thank you to those of us who are following the event via live stream. We know that you're there, and we welcome you to participate in the conversation as things go along. As always with our events, you can tweet your questions using the hashtag WallaceHouse. And for those of you in the room, you should have received question cards as you came in. We have Knight Wallace Fellows around the room. If you could just raise your hands, those of you who are going to be helping collect cards. And if you have a question, write it down. Just raise your hand. Someone will come along and collect it, and we'll incorporate your questions into the discussion part of the event. So I want to take a moment to just tell you what I mean when I say the Eisendrath Symposium. For some of you here in the room, that name rings instant bells. For some, it does not. Charles Eisendrath ran Wallace House, the Knight Wallace Fellows Program, for 30 years. And why we have this particular event to honor Charles is that in building this remarkable program of ours, one of the things that he did to make this distinctive was to make international journalism a central part of what Wallace House is about and our mission through the fellowship and with the Livingston Awards. And by international journalism, we mean American journalists who are working overseas and also international journalists who are practicing the craft around the world and here in the United States. We have, for the fellowship program, we bring 18 to 20 journalists to the university every year. Roughly 12 of them are American fellows, and we always have 6 to 8 international journalists. And so when Charles retired a couple of years ago and I took over the program, we wanted to figure out a way to honor Charles's contributions, which have been many, but really taking a special moment to acknowledge the role of international journalism felt like the best way to honor Charles. And so this is our second Eisendrath Symposium, and we hope you will join us every year. It's also a chance for us to introduce you to our fellows. And as a feature of this program every year, there will be Knight Wallace Fellows. And so we thank you for coming out. We know you'll enjoy the conversation today. But before we get to the conversation, I want to invite the handsome man in the front row to come up and say a few words.
I mean, if you went out to pick a successor, I mean, how could you beat this? This is a dazzling woman who's just really wonderful for me. Thank you. I also want to thank the wonderful Wallace House staff that supports her and everything that Wallace House does. If you spend a long time in journalism, one thing that dawns on you is a really unpredictable irony. How many times an event or subject scheduled months in advance coincides with the exact moment that the topic comes to the fore? Today, our distinguished panel is going to talk about Chinese soft power. I believe that our president's tariff initiative is about to demonstrate, without a doubt, some of China's soft power, and no doubt at our expense. So the last thing I want to say is how much this symposium means to me and to Julia, who's here with me and helped run Wallace House for a long time. It means an enormous amount. And I love the tradition, the new tradition, of bringing in journalists and showcasing international media. It does, was the most important part of my professional life. And finally, thank you all for coming on the first beautiful day of what will no doubt be a dazzling spring. Thank you.
So we're going to get to the main event. And for those of you who've been to several Wallace House events, you know that one of the things that we really prize is collaboration. And one of the benefits of bringing the work we do at Wallace House out into the public sphere and doing things that are for the entire university is it gives us a chance to work with colleagues across the university who share interest and expertise and the passions of the journalists that we bring to our program. So we're happy to have moderating this conversation today Mary Gallagher. She's a professor of political science at the University of Michigan, and she's the director of the Center for Chinese Studies, and so perfect for this. And busy, I think, recently during a little thing called the Party Congress, and so we're glad that she's here with us. She's also faculty associate at the Center for Comparative Political Studies at the Institute for Social Research. And she's the author of several books on China, the most recent one being Authoritarian Legality in China, Law, Workers, and the State. It was published last year by the Cambridge University Press. And we're going to allow Professor Gallagher to introduce you to our Knight Wallace Fellows, current and returning, who are going to have a conversation with us today. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynette, and thank you, Charles. I'm really happy to be here to moderate and introduce. I'm going to start with some definitions. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page about what soft power is, although I learned last night Louisa does not believe in soft power, which I'm sure will come up. I want to paraphrase from a 2004 Foreign Affairs review of a book by Joseph Nye, who is sort of the person who coined this term, soft power, and the review is written by John Eikenberry. The name of the book was Soft Power, The Means to Success in World Politics. The definition that John Eikenberry uses for soft power is the ability of a country to persuade others to do what it wants without force or coercion. Nye argues that successful states need both hard and soft power, the ability to coerce others, as well as the ability to shape their long-term attitudes and preferences. Nye was writing in the post-9/11 world about the United States, and he argued that the United States excels in projecting soft power with the help of its companies, foundations, universities, churches, and other institutions of civil society. U.S. culture, ideas, and values have been extraordinarily important in helping Washington attract partners and supporters. This is Eikenberry writing on Nye. Eikenberry credits Nye's acknowledgement of the limits of soft power. It tends to have only diffuse effects. And also, societies can embrace American values and culture, but resist U.S. foreign policy. In sum, Eikenberry wrote that Nye's message is that U.S. security hinges as much on winning hearts and minds as on winning wars. So we're here today to talk about China's soft power, not the United States, and we do so at a moment in time when America's soft power might be at its lowest point since ... I wrote, since the Vietnam War, since the end of the Cold War, since the end of World War II. I don't know. It's also a moment in time that follows some momentous changes in Beijing during the National People's Congress, in which President Xi Jinping removed term limits for his position and the vice presidency, and other major changes to the Constitution and to the party and government were made. China seems poised to further extend its hard and soft power. It also comes at a moment in time when concern over that extension of China's hard, soft, and now there's a new term, sharp power, has increased in many countries, particularly Australia and the United States, as I can attest to being in DC last week, where many congressmen mentioned China's soft power and its infiltration into American universities. So some initial questions that I have, which may be the subject of our discussion today, or may be jettisoned for things that come out on Twitter or from the audience. I have 3 questions. What defines the principles and values of China's soft power? What institutions are most successful in disseminating China's soft power, and why? And finally, are changes in soft power zero-sum? That is, does an increase in Chinese soft power automatically reduce the soft power of other countries like the United States? So without further ado, I will introduce our panelists in the order that they will be speaking. So the first speaker will be Marc Magnier. He is a current Knight Wallace Fellow, and he was the Beijing-based China economics editor for the Wall Street Journal from 2014 to 2017, where he oversaw coverage of the world's second largest economy and its seismic impact on Chinese society and the rest of the world. Before joining the journal, he worked at the Los Angeles Times as bureau chief in New Delhi, Beijing, and Tokyo, covering the Mumbai terror attack, the Beijing Olympics, and the Sichuan earthquake, Japan's tsunami, and Fukushima nuclear disaster. Along the way, he's camped with goats under Saddam Hussein's bridges, covered suicide attacks and budding film industries in Pakistan, and suffered through bad karaoke in North Korea. He holds a bachelor's degree cum laude from Columbia College and a master's degree from the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. Our second speaker is Louisa Lim. Louisa was a Knight Wallace Fellow at the University of Michigan in 2013 to 2014, but she stayed on campus for 2 years past that as the visiting Marsh Professor in the Department of Communication Studies. Louisa is the author of The People's Republic of Amnesia, Tiananmen Revisited. It was published by Oxford University Press in 2014. It was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize and the Helen Bernstein Award for Excellence in Journalism. She's an award-winning journalist who reported from China for a decade for NPR and the BBC, and she's now a senior lecturer in audiovisual journalism at the University of Melbourne. And she's the co-host of the Little Red Podcast, a monthly podcast focusing on China beyond the Beijing Beltway. She also just launched a new podcast, a master class about podcasting. So it's a podcast about podcast. Okay. Our third speaker is Dio Ayeta. He's a current Knight Wallace Fellow, and he's an investigative reporter and the founder and executive director of the International Center for Investigative Reporting, a nonprofit news agency in Nigeria. And in this role, he has trained more than 100 reporters aiming to promote a culture of data-driven accountability journalism in Nigeria. In 2009, he was a U.S. State Department International Visitors Leadership Fellow, and in 2010, a National Endowment for Democracy Reagan-Faskell Fellow. As a journalist and a media trainer, his interests lie in digital safety and encrypted communication, and he holds a bachelor's degree in English language and theater arts from the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Marc, who will be speaking about China's soft power.
Thank you all. Is that better? Okay. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Lynette and Charles, for all your incredible hard work building up the fellowship, which has just been an amazing experience. And thank you all for coming. Really great to see you. Soft power. Another definition I've heard for soft power is if someone comes and puts a gun to your head and takes your wallet, it's hard power. If they try to convince you that you should give them your wallet, that's soft power. Maybe a little bit easier way to conceptualize it in foreign policy. What I'd like to do is take a brief swing through China's relationship with soft power and how it got here, and then look at one of its probably most concrete, literally and figuratively, soft power elements, which is the Silk Road Initiative, the One Belt, One Road. So, essentially, China comes out of the Cultural Revolution and the Tiananmen massacre, and it has a bit of a PR problem. And so Joseph Nye comes along in 1990 with this idea of soft power. China initially thinks that it is a capitalist Western plot to keep it down, but soon realizes that this is actually something that will solve a few of its issues, a few of its problems. One being its very bad, or often bad, reputation with the rest of the world. Another being how it makes overtures to Taiwan. It was decided that culture is, in many ways, the lowest common denominator, a way of doing that. It then goes into overdrive. The big seminal event was the 17th Party Congress, when President Hu Jintao mentions it, and as you well know, once the emperor mentions something, all the taps unfold and unleash. This led to enormous spending on international media over the next several years, on the Confucius Institute program of language institutes, which went from 1 institute in 2004, the first one in Seoul, to about 500 today, and about 1,000 Confucius classrooms for high schoolers. And then it sort of took it from there. Then we have the arrival of President Xi Jinping, who takes a little bit of a, as we well know now, takes a bit of a harder stance on things, is a tougher leader in many ways. And so we've seen, I think, the efforts slightly weaken on soft power. This also coincides with questions about both inside and outside China, I think, on whether they're getting their money's worth. China spends an estimated, it's hard to get numbers on this, but they spend an estimated $10 billion a year, according to some, $10 billion. This compares with the US, which spends about $670 million on all its various programs. So one of the big initiatives has been it's got various names. The One Belt, One Road doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, and it's even weirder because the road is on the ocean and the belt is on the land. It's a translation issue. But this was an idea that China would marshal its resources to create a modern Silk Road traveling from Asia to Europe to try to link these two regions, to expand its regional clout in many ways, to help its some of its peripheral provinces that are economically depressed, and to basically kind of expand its power. It's loosey-goosey. There's no real map. You can't get a map out of the Chinese government. It seems to pull together, which China often does, a lot of its existing plans and programs to make a big grand headline. But it's supposed to involve about 65 countries, about 60% of the global population is encompassed, about 35% of the global economy, and spend anywhere from $4 to $8 trillion. Now, some of the problems that we're looking at, when in doing some pieces on this, Kazakhstan is one of the countries along the way, and so talking to people there, but I think in many ways it's reflective of some of the issues that you're seeing along the road here, China has tended to be most comfortable working top-down. It likes to work with dictators or others that are at the very top of a society. It's not so good working with NGOs, with people's groups, and so there's quite a bit of concern that it may sort of run roughshod over some of that. Another concern has been the debt that many of these countries are absorbing to try to build these roads. It's often a shared partnership, and many of these countries have several times their annual GDP is tied up with loans. This raises concerns that China will eventually take control of many of the assets in their country and exert enormous power over them. Finally, I guess, just suspicion a bit over what its longer-term objectives are. People from Kazakhstan said to me, we're a tiny country and there are so many Chinese, and I just fear we're going to get run over here. So these are some of the concerns. This is one of the, I think, one of the elements, and we'll talk about several others among the panel, but that kind of gives you an idea of one of their probably most dramatic and major initiatives on soft power. Thank you.
So honored to be invited back. Thank you, Charles and Julia, for the Eisendrath Symposium, and thank you to Lynette and Birgit for all the organization. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about how that influence and power is playing out in Australia in different ways. And I will start with this idea of soft power. How useful is it to use that as a term? And I guess for this I was kind of influenced because I did a panel with Bates Gill from the Australian National University, and he said when it comes to China, soft power and hard power are not useful distinctions. You should talk about Chinese influence projection. So I'm going to talk about Chinese influence projection and also the ways in which what we traditionally think of as soft power kind of tips into hard power. So that's why I think influence projection might be a more useful way of talking about it. And I'm going to talk about it in three different areas: in politics, education, and the media in Australia. I think Australia is a very interesting case because it's like the canary in the coal mine, the petri dish, because it's so heavily dependent on China. A third of Australia's export dollars go to China. When it comes to sort of tourism, education, resource extraction, Australia is very heavily dependent on China, and there's also large Chinese communities. So I think it's really the leading edge of United Front work. And the United Front was set up in the 1930s and 40s to reach out beyond traditional communist constituencies like workers and peasants and soldiers, and to build support with other groups of people like intellectuals and capitalists. And it's now become a real key part of Communist Party functioning, a magic weapon as it's called. So I want to just sort of explain how that looks on the ground. So in Australia, the first area where there's been a huge amount of debate and controversy about Chinese influences in politics. There have been Chinese businessmen who've been key political donors, and this has been a loophole in the law. There's been no law against foreign political donations, so that's really opened the way for large amounts of Chinese money to kind of slosh around the system. And then there was a big scandal over a politician called Sam Dastyari who quit after taking money from Chinese businessmen, but what he did was he publicly stated positions that differed from his party's position over the South China Sea. And not just that, but I think even more interestingly, in Parliament, over 3 years in the Senate, he asked 115 different questions focusing on China's concerns about the South China Sea and about Australia's relationship with Japan. So this was enough. The ensuing scandal was enough to make him quit. So that's one way where we've seen Chinese influence in politics, but we're also seeing large mobilizations of Chinese communities in Australia, and that happens. There was, for example, a demonstration over the South China Sea in Melbourne. We see large numbers of Chinese community groups coming out to welcome Chinese officials when they visit Australia. And we're also seeing action on social media, WeChat, for example, being used to influence voters, Chinese voters, in Australian by-elections. So that's something that's super interesting and that's happening in Australia. The second area that I'm going to talk about is education, and there are all kinds of ways in which China's influence is playing out in Australian education, with very large numbers of Chinese students. I think it was 160,000 at last count in Australian universities. And again, Chinese businessmen paying large amounts of money, giving large amounts of money to universities to build institutes, to build buildings. But I'll talk about one area that I did some reporting on for The Guardian because I think it's particularly interesting, and it also really shows this kind of soft power, hard power, sharp power how those definitions don't particularly work. And it's about the Confucius Institute. So Australia is the first place in the world where a Confucius Institute was set up in a government department. So in New South Wales, the Department of Education set up a Confucius Institute within that department. And it's really interesting because the makeup of it is two people, the 4 people that work there, 2 of them are funded by the Department of Education in New South Wales. 2 of them are funded from China by the Hanban, which is affiliated with the Ministry of Education. So if you start looking about what that actually means, it's within the charter of all Confucius Institutes that their budget and activity is approved by the Hanban. So effectively what you have is an Australian government department where certain parts of their activities go back to Beijing for approval. So there's potential bureaucrats with a veto power over things done inside an Australian government department. So as well as these are the people who are guiding Chinese language education inside Australia. So you can really see where the potential is for propaganda to be embedded in other countries' education systems. And there are many, many other examples of this kind of thing. But I don't want to talk for too long. The third area I was going to talk about is media. And we've seen a real move to take over independent media outlets which are bought up by pro-Communist Party businessmen. And I think particularly the most interesting recent development is the use of defamation laws in Australia to muzzle discussion about China. And the most recent case we've seen is the book by Clive Hamilton, which just came out about Communist Party influence in Australia, and that was dropped by his publisher, Allen and Unwin, who'd published 9 of his books. Then 3 other publishers refused to publish it because of the fear of defamation suits. Australia's defamation laws are very, very stringent. Although New South Wales has 7 times less people than the UK, it has the same number of defamation suits. And it's well known that there's a lot of cases where Chinese businessmen or Chinese affiliated people will sue for defamation. So a big story by the ABC in Fairfax that came out last year landed them with not 1 but 2 defamation suits. And we've seen, even in my own reporting, I can see what kind of a chilling impact that has on freedom of expression. So in stories that I have written about China, they've been legal not by 1 lawyer, but by 2 lawyers. Each lawyer would take things out, and they would take out things that in other places, it's quite unprecedented, direct quotes from interviewees, information that is already in the public domain that has been printed in Chinese, in Chinese language newspapers will be removed because of the perception that a defamation suit is quite likely. So in Hong Kong, we've seen this kind of thing called lawfare, so the use of the common law system by CCP-affiliated people or bodies as a weapon, and it's very effective. So I think we're seeing that in Australia as well. So I think that, I won't say much more, but I just think that the case of Australia is worth looking at because of the way in which the particularity of Australia's case is being used so effectively, and I think it's been quite successful.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to thank Charles and Lynette and the Wallace House staff, all the fellows here, and everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm happy to be here. So I want to talk about the African perspective to Chinese soft power. And I've heard a lot about what the world thinks of China and Africa, but what does Africa think, and what do Africans think? And so I'm going to start by giving some very shocking to me, statistics, data about China's influence in Africa. In 2016, Afrobarometer came out with a survey, the result of a survey it conducted in several countries in Africa, which indicated that 63% of the respondents, Africans, believe that China has had a positive influence on economies in Africa. That varies lower and upper in several places. In a place like Mali, for example, where China owns virtually everything, construction, roads, airports, and so on, hospitals, it's up to 92%. So 92% of Malians say that China has had a great influence on their country. And why is this so? I'm not part of the 63% because I have a lot of misgivings about the long-term, implications of Chinese influence in Africa. And I'd like to disaggregate the data, in terms of who did they talk to, the age, and all that. Because I believe that perhaps older generations like mine in Africa would find it difficult to change age-long perceptions about China and what it represents in the world. So why is it that in a place like Mali, 92% of the population thinks that China is doing very well in their country? It's because everywhere you go in Africa, in many African countries, in Mozambique, even the rich countries like, South Africa, Nigeria, you find everywhere construction, aviation, transportation, seaport, airport. The Chinese are everywhere constructing. Today in Africa, maybe about 5 years ago, the figure was about 1 million. Now perhaps 1.5, 2 million Chinese in Africa. And so what has happened is, talking about soft power, I think that the strategy that China has adopted in different places has depended largely on what their goals are. I don't think there's any standard or standardized agenda across the world. In Africa, what they have done is deploy both soft power and hard power, or sharp power as they call it now. And sharp power, not in terms of coercion, but in terms of throwing money at these poor countries, developing countries that need a lot of money for infrastructural development and all that. And so in terms of the hard power, what has it done? In 2015, President Xi Jinping, after several years of, development funds to Africa, committed another $60 billion to Africa. And mind you, in talking about soft power and Chinese influence, Chinese involvement in Africa, China makes the distinction that its relationship with Africa is not that of a donor, a giver and receiver kind of relationship. Its partnership, it partners with Africa. The buzzword is cooperation. It's cooperating, partnering with African countries, investing in those African countries, but the lines are blurred. So are they giving Africa aid, donations, or making investments? The truth of the matter is that even though Chinese officials would not explicitly explain this, the truth is that these are not aids. They are not aid money. They are long-term loans that are repaid. In many of the African countries, in a place like Guinea, for example, Guinea has committed 45% of its mineral resources for years to China. So what China has developed is a new age barter system where it gives enormous resources to African countries and takes back the natural resources in those countries. It is investing enormous amounts of money. And so today, China has superseded America and any other country as Africa's biggest trade partners. The figures say in 2010, for example, the figures have jumped from $10 million in 2010 to 2014, about 220 million. I think it's in terms of billions even, $1 billion. That's 20-fold. America's investment in Africa is reducing by the year. Conversely, Chinese investment in Africa are increasing. And so the 92% of the people who say that China has had a wonderful influence in Africa, what question do you want us to ask them? They need the funds. The funds are not coming from Europe or America. Here comes a wonderful person who says, I have all the money for you, and I'm not giving you conditionalities and all that. I don't care about, human rights and all those due process and stuff. Why wouldn't I take it? It looks so attractive. So in terms of hard power, that is what China has done. To a large extent, I have my misgivings about Chinese investment, but what worries many people is in terms of soft power. So China is, let me give the example of how China has taken over virtually, the media in Africa. And I give this example. So if you have cable TV and you don't have money for subscription, you have free access to Chinese CGTN. It's the only, in many of the African countries that I've been to, South Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Ghana, Nigeria, it's the only cable TV station that is free. So it has news stations, it has documentaries that talk about culture and arts. It is in French and English, and I suspect in Portuguese, Africa, in Portuguese. And so there is a great immersion. So in houses, offices, hotels, for months and perhaps years, direct transmission broadcast, what you see in many homes are Chinese news items, news about the world from an entirely Chinese perspective. Nothing else does the work China wants to do in Africa about changing its image than that, directly. So the other thing is China is investing a whole lot of money on scholarships for Africans. So every year, up to 20,000 students from Africa, free of charge. The first thing they have to do is spend 1 year learning Chinese language, and then, they graduate. They go back home, beholding to China, and occupy high offices and all that. That is the future generation Chinese-centric African leaders. I think I'll stop here and we can talk around these issues.
Thanks, everyone. So we're going to have a discussion, but I want to remind the audience, too, that we'll be collecting questions, and we'll move to open the discussion to people's questions at some point soon. So if you have questions that you've written, if you raise your hand, someone will come around to collect them. So I want to start off, I guess, to bring it back to the first question that I asked. I think everybody addressed different ways in which Chinese soft power is manifest in Belt and Road or in Africa and in Australia. And it's a question that I raised this question because it was also raised last Friday at the Ford School of Public Policy, where we had a workshop on China's international impact on development, where we talked a lot about these initiatives like Belt and Road. And the keynote speaker, who was a former official in the Obama administration, asked, what are the principles and values that define Chinese soft power? Because I think it's a really interesting thing to think about in terms of not just, we've been talking a lot about influence and about material aid, but I would like to know if people can, if they want to also articulate what they think the values are behind. Because I think soft power fundamentally has to be about something more than just money.
So I would say, I think that's a really interesting question. And I think when we try and answer that, one of the things that we need to look at is politics in China and what's happening within China. And of course, the biggest current issue is the removal of term limits and Xi Jinping's opening the way to Xi Jinping, the chairman of everything, becoming the chairman of everything potentially forever. And within the context of that, I think we need to look at how these issues are placed. So to me, it comes back to the work of the United Front Work Department within the Chinese system. It's interesting that under Xi Jinping, this has become a leading working group, so that kind of concentrates the power and brings it under him. But in the last few years, it's notable that its staff has expanded by 40,000 people. Now, if you think about foreign aid, China's foreign aid department has just 100 staff. So what are those 40,000 people doing? I think that's a very big question that we don't know the answers to, because that is, it's not at all transparent. But I think we also, if we want to know what the principles and values that Xi Jinping abides by are, we need to look at the discourse and the language that he uses. And of course, what the ultimate aim is this idea that of a rebalancing of power. There's been a unilateral domination, a unipolar world for too long. And I think the phrase that comes up time and time again in China in recent years has been this idea of national rejuvenation. And it's interesting that in Chinese, 中华民族复兴, the 中华 can also be, some people translate that as a race thing, the rejuvenation of the Chinese race. But this kind of rejuvenation, I think, is something that's very central to Xi Jinping's idea of what China can be. And, we see that in all kinds of ways. But there was one sentence that was, I just read this morning in a Global Times article. The Global Times is a bit of a tabloid in China, but it does often reflect some of the kind of most extreme thinking. And when it was talking about Australia, this article, which was written by an author known as Zhong Sheng, the voice of the Chinese, was criticizing the debate in Australia and said, while it is economically dependent on China, it shows little gratitude. So this seems to raise these, old ideas, almost of a tributary system. And I think all of these things are worth thinking about when it comes to China's principles.
I've looked quite a bit for some sort of justification, some sort of bold idea that comes out of China's efforts to expand its reputation abroad. And they essentially kind of fall back on, I think, economic success, on the way they try to dress up the One Belt, One Road idea into something that's a little more conceptual seems to be connectivity. That is kind of about as far as you can get. So a couple of things come to mind. One is that you have to give China a little bit of slack sometimes, because I think they've come amazingly far, amazingly fast. They've created a new model. They've been vaunted onto the global stage very quickly. And I'm not sure if the United States in 1920 had, they probably did 1920 already, but say the 1880s or the 1860s had anything, any great pronouncement of what American power was, because they were still in the shadow of the British Empire. The other thing is that I think the one way of looking at soft power is also that I think, unlike most other countries or many other countries, it's at least as much about kind of appealing to their domestic audience as it is the outside. I think in many ways they've almost written off large elements of the international audience as sort of being against them. And so I think the idea of harmony, of pride, as Luisa says, of unity under the Communist Party, which is the entity that brought, that explicated shame and brought pride back to the country is really strong. And so many of these things that perhaps they're doing overseas are really to kind of bolster their image at home as well.
Because you seem to be saying that actually in Africa, the emphasis on material power and the way in which building infrastructure and fueling development actually does create a lot of support. So in the end, soft power could be something about money and aid.
Yes, it is. But also, Chinese has even more reason to engage, in diplomatic means, soft power, using other means apart from cash to win over Africans. Because in Nigeria, for example, let me speak about Nigeria, where I come from. I grew up, and that's why I think that it's not succeeding too well with the older generation, because I grew up, and everywhere in Nigeria, if you mention China or Chinese made, what it meant was substandard, fake, or something negative like that. And so if there's a region in Nigeria, Aba, and now it's developed on its own. But when it started, they would mimic products, and they would churn out substandard products. And rather than say Aba made, we will say China made. And so changing that perception, that image, Africa is attractive to China for a number of reasons. One of them is the fact that Africa has such huge resources that China needs for its own back home burgeoning development. But also, Africa has such a huge market. And so for it to operate in any meaningful, sustainable way on the continent, it needs to change, the perception and all that. And one of the ways, apart from, using the media and other things, education and all that, that it's doing is the Chinese on ground in each country in Africa are doing a huge job of selling China in Africa. It's a dicey situation, because some of them, because of their natural instinct to, I'm talking about trade practices, their lack of respect for normal traditional labor laws and so on. And so it's also creating problems for the image of China. And so I think that is one way in which you can justify what China thinks it's doing in Africa and other parts of the world.
Do you have any sense how Africans think about leader for life, since Africa has a certain number of those itself?
Well, personally, and I think in many ways, China's relationship with Africa has been, at par since maybe the 60s. And it doesn't matter who the leader is, the China in Africa policy has been, it has scaled up, but it's always been the same thing. And so Xi Jinping's attempt to stay in power for life it resonates well with me. For example, everywhere in Africa we had dictators and all that. So I think that China is borrowing a leaf from Africa rather than Africa borrowing a leaf from China in that manner.
I have another question which relates to one of the things that was written about in the Joseph Nye book, that American soft power came not so much, or maybe not predominantly, from US foreign policy or from the US government, but it came from these institutions that we tend to count as non-governmental or civil society, like universities or churches. And whether or not you think that the China, so you brought up this Bates-Gill argument that hard and soft power, you can't differentiate it in China, but I think part of that reason is because these institutions themselves are hard to differentiate, because when we talk about universities or Chinese companies or even, say, Chinese media, most of that is, at least to some degree, still state-owned and state-controlled. So does that actually, sometimes we think, oh, they're so organized, and the way in which it can project soft power through United Front activities is much more powerful than the United States, where our soft power, United States soft power, was quite fragmented, and of course, at different times, you know, a US multinational could be in opposition to the US administration on foreign policy. But is it really the case that that kind of centralization is a benefit? Because I think it makes us question when either Chinese projecting soft power or people who are recipients of it, like the Australian politician you mentioned. I mean, perhaps he just thinks that China's South China Sea position is a good one and he wants to defend it, but it's questioned as legitimate because it's perceived to be a function of propaganda.
I think in answering that, I'll come back to this question that you asked right at the beginning about whether or not it's a zero-sum game. And I do think in Australia, a lot of the debate is centered on the perception that it is a zero-sum game. Whether or not it is, I think the perception is there that it is. And I think one of the problems that is underlying a lot of the discussion is American foreign policy right now, because in Australia, from the Australian perspective, you have a president who, even though there are US troops that are stationed in Darwin, you have an American president who humiliates your prime minister publicly, who says he has the very worst conversation, the worst deal of all deals with him, who's kind of flip-flopping back and forth on, you know, for example, this deal on refugees that was signed under the Obama administration. Trump very much wanted to pull out of that deal. And so from an Australian perspective, one of the things that China offers is a kind of consistency, which is lacking in many cases throughout all the mixed messages that are coming from the US. And I think in many ways that has its benefits, because this is perhaps also where the leader for life to some countries may look kind of appealing, because at least you know for many years that there's going to be a consistency of message and a consistency of purpose. And when you have an administration that's flip-flopping on every issue almost daily, then it's very hard to deal with.
So I think we should start to open it up unless we have something. And I actually now will give control over who chooses the question. I'm not choosing your question, so you can't blame me if your question is not answered. They will be read aloud by other fellows.
Hi all, I'm Chitrangada. I'm a Knight Wallace Fellow from India. We have a nice range of questions, so the one I'm going to start with, the person qualifies that the question is only half tongue-in-cheek, and the question is, how can we convince China to help with the roads and infrastructure in this country?
No, in Michigan.
Yikes.
Belt and Road.
Beg? I don't know. sell out the country? I don't know. It's a good question, and I think, like all domestic political issues, it's going to come down to the U.S. reaching a consensus and deciding that this is a worthwhile and profitable thing to do. And our president certainly would like to do that, but given his record on passing anything other than the tax bill, I don't know how far we're going to get on it, but certainly Michigan needs it.
Okay, the next question is, when the African people get tired of Chinese new colonialism, what keeps them from kicking them out like the old colonialists?
I think the question came up, first and foremost, I thought of something yesterday, and I thought that there are African countries that are so indebted to China that if China asks for them to pay up, their economies will just collapse. And that is very scary. But to the question, what Africa will do, I think that many of the countries on the continent are so indebted to the Chinese to the extent that they have committed their resources. For example, in Nigeria, the $1 billion or $2 billion railway project that China is funding, we're not paying for it in cash. It's a long-term loan, and they are taking their money back in oil. And so they have access to enormous resources on the continent. And so I think that because the resources remain to be available, it's attractive for now for both parties to continue this marriage of convenience. When the divorce will come, nobody can say yet, or whether it will come.
Just add that I think it's with smaller countries, China's going to have enormous leverage over. There's a great quote from the president of the Maldives, who's bemoaning the amount of debt that the country's getting into China. He says, "Without firing a single shot, China has grabbed more land than the East India Company at the height of the 19th century." But I think there's a couple of issues here too that further out on the horizon that are potentially problematic. One is that China's already poured in billions and billions into Venezuela with the promise of getting oil revenue in return, but that has gone sour really quickly. There are similar questions about Pakistan. So if enough of this is bad debt and builds up over time, there is some concern in Beijing that this could be a systemic issue that starts to affect the global economy. The second thing that's kind of almost equally interesting is growing feelings sometimes in China as growth slows down. Well, why are you giving so much money to everybody else? Why not bring it back home? Some of the same arguments we're seeing in America, and you don't hear a lot about that, but I think there's starting to be pushback domestically too.
We'll just take a question from Twitter. So this person asks, what about China's recently diminished role in the Korean peace talks? Doesn't it demonstrate that China's soft power is constrained by monetary policy and not demonstrable for real diplomacy?
On karaoke in North Korea.
Sorry.
He gets to answer it.
Just a couple of points on that. I think the six-party talks, which were the construct that was created to talk to North Korea, was really a decision by the United States, which did not want to give one-on-one face to North Korea. They wanted to diffuse this. So China became, in many ways, the broker. Now we're in a very different situation where Trump has gone off the rails and wants to talk to this dictator one-on-one, and so that kind of obviates the idea that China's been pushed out. It was sort of face-saving on that. Then there's another part of this issue, which is sort of China trying to, China's anger at South Korea over something called THAAD, which is a horrible acronym for a missile system that the U.S. has put in there, ostensibly to get to protect against North Korean missiles, but actually China believes, probably properly, that it's really aimed at China. And so that's led to various punitive actions against South Korea. So I think it's less an issue of their monetary and financial situation than the complex politics on the peninsula.
There's a question for Louisa. What's the relationship between Chinese soft power and the Chinese diaspora in Australia?
It's a really interesting issue, and it's also one that there's been a lot of discussion about because there are different Chinese Australian communities. There is an older, more established one, and then we've seen a sort of rush of young Chinese migrants, and particularly large numbers of Chinese students. So there are kind of different sets of Chinese communities within Australia, and there are also different moves to almost capture those communities. So one of the very influential businessmen who set up, who gave a lot of money to politicians, whose name is Huang Xiangmo, he was the chairman of a council called something like the Australia Council for the Peaceful Reunification of China, which was really an umbrella group that worked with a lot of local community groups. And this was often used to organize and mobilize community groups, for example, to welcome Li Keqiang when he visited in 2016, to protest in 2016 about the South China Sea when an international tribunal in The Hague, when they issued a ruling against China. And these kind of community organizations have been quite effective in many ways in mobilizing smaller community groups. And now that we have this discussion over changing the law to close the loopholes that allow foreign political donations, we're seeing how these community groups are also being very effective in driving the debate, and they're calling this anti-Chinese racism. They're accusing the current government of hysteria and paranoia and slandering Chinese students in Australia and things like this. And of course, that's a message that does play quite well with many in the Chinese community who feel that there isn't a careful enough differentiation between China and Chinese Australians and sort of CCP, Communist Party. And so that everybody gets sort of targeted with this idea of being Chinese. And of course, in many ways, this is a problem that is created by the Communist Party itself, which has tried to almost capture the idea of Chinese-ness. But it is a message that has been playing well among communities. So I think that it's also quite a complex dynamic that is quite effective, actually, in turning the debate from a debate about Chinese influence in Australia to a debate about Chinese racism in public discourse. And so, you know, in a way, the debate gets hijacked and shifted onto something else completely.
I think, too, just to add something about the distinction that Louisa made earlier, which I think is a really important one, to think about these two concepts as completely different. Chinese influence projection, which is something that the state and the party does through United Front organizations, through Confucius Institutes, and China's soft power, because China's soft power can come from many different things that are completely unrelated to influence projection, although they're often hijacked for that, and they're often then conflated within the debate going on in the United States and Australia. So, for example, when I was in DC last week, there are bills in the Senate and in the House to declare Confucius Institutes as foreign agents, as well as to reduce the number of Chinese students coming to the United States. And this is simply because there's this conflation of influence projection and Chinese soft power, or even Chinese people traveling abroad or studying abroad. But when we think about soft power, for me, I think about the ability of China's infrastructure, so that my son, who's 12, when we went to an air show in Maine a couple of years ago, we were looking at World War II planes built by the United States, and then there was a display of Chinese high-speed rail. So my son believes that we peaked in World War II, and China has taken over. Or the way in which WeChat and sort of social media in China has advanced much further than, say, what it has in the United States. Or most importantly, of course, Chinese food, which is the most important part of China's soft power, I would argue.
Just add one quick one on that. It's oftentimes, I think, the state manages to stomp on some of the really good natural soft power aspects that they have. And the example is in February, where they decided to ban hip-hop, and the justification given was drug use and promiscuity in its lyrics depart from the moral conduct the party demands. So.
Luisa, there was a related question, so I thought I'll ask that. The defamation lawsuits you mentioned, a member of the audience wants to know, were they brought by Chinese or Australian citizens?
I'm not entirely, I think one of them was bought by a businessman who is Australian citizen, and I think the reason, I might be wrong, but I think the reason that he bought it was the imputation of disloyalty to Australia. The second lawsuit, which was brought in particular in this one case, so this was a case about some reporting on Chinese wealth and power done by ABC in Fairfax. And the second case was very interesting. It was brought by a student called Lupin, who is the president of the Chinese Scholars and Students Association at the university, at Canberra University, sorry. And she was interviewed in this piece, and she was interviewed as saying that the Chinese embassy had given some funding to the Chinese Scholars and Students Association. And then she filed, after the piece came out, she filed a defamation lawsuit. And she alleges that she was lured into the interview without disclosing the true nature of what she was to be interviewed about, and without an interpreter, because she answered in English, even though she's studying in Australia, clearly in English. And among the things that she complained about was that extracts in the interview had been published out of context, and that there was one question that was in the script but had not been put to her in the interview. And so, I mean, from a journalistic perspective, this kind of lawsuit could have a very chilling effect on journalism. And I mean, it's one of the peculiarities of defamation cases in Australia, that it's much, much more expensive to fight them than to just settle them. So in many cases, just the threat of a defamation case is enough to close down discussion. And particularly when it came to the publication of Clive Hamilton's book, the reasons that the publishers gave for not publishing it or for dropping the publication was not just the possibility of defamation cases, but also the possibility that they might be hacked, and the possible loss of business within China. And one would assume that the third one is probably a very major one, and it's also a reason why we've seen in academic journals, we are seeing cases of China trying to stop academic journals from allowing certain content deemed as sensitive from being accessed within China, and certain publishers like Springer have agreed to do that. One reason is because of the potential economic losses.
There's a question from Twitter. I think this is a journalist in Nigeria asking this. With China's rising influence in Africa and the rest of the world, and its recent adoption of one-man rule, how should the media in Africa respond to the coverage of China's influence in the continent?
Well, interesting. Like I said, increasingly, China understands the importance of using the media on the continent. And so what has happened in the last, I'm going to come back to the question, what has happened in the last, particularly 1 year, after CCTV changed its name from CCTV China, what is CCTV? China Central China TV to CGTN is China Global TV or something, television network, is that more and more Africans are being recruited on the continent to report for the TV stations. And so, of course, they're reporting about events in Africa from a purely Chinese perspective. But to the question, how does, it doesn't matter, I'm covering an event on Africa. The important thing is Africans are covering Africa from an African perspective. So as a Nigerian, for example, it doesn't matter. My initial interest in China actually started in 2014 when I did an investigation on illegal logging of wood in Nigeria. Exotic wood, particularly rosewood. And so Chinese businessmen were, because of corruption and all that, they found it easy to come to Nigeria and targeted several regions in Nigeria where there was an abundance of rosewood. And the wood was being felled indiscriminately, abused to the ecology and all that, and they will ferry this wood to Lagos and then ship them to China and all that. And so how do I report as a Nigerian what is happening? We reported about Chinese corruption, we reported about Nigerian corruption, we reported the truth. And so the thing for me as a Nigerian journalist to do, and I think for an African journalist to do, is report the issues as they are. Government media in Nigeria, for example, will never do the kind of story that I did, but there are lots of other journalists who will do critical reporting and all that. So I think that the most important consideration for me is that, am I saying the truth? There's a lot of things that are happening on the continent because of Chinese trade practices and all that, that worry us. And we are focusing on them because the government, our governments are receiving enormous resources from the Chinese, and they are closing their eyes to a lot of things. For example, one of the things we wrote about last year when the rail project started was China gives you money, but the contract will be executed by Chinese company, and then they bring everything from China. And I was giving the example, I was talking to my Zambian friend, so this is not even in Nigeria. So the airport or whatever project in Zambia is being executed by a Chinese company. It brings all the staff from China, including the driver, the person who drives the truck, for Christ's sake. There are no drivers in Zambia, including the person who, so because of risks and all that in traffic, the guy who stands by the road and waves a flag, menial work, and they bring all that from China, and our government closes out. So I think it's the responsibility of African journalists to tell the truth and warn about what the implications of Chinese influence in Africa might be in the future.
How much of US soft power comes from popular culture, music, and film? And is this type of soft power realistic for China?
I think there is a significant impact from that kind of soft power, and one of the ways that you see that is the fact that there are restrictions on how many American films are shown in China every year. I think it used to be only 10 a year, and it's recently been raised to a higher number, but, you know, it is because these are so attractive to Chinese audiences that I think these restrictions were put in place. I think Hollywood and entertainment is one of the areas where we are seeing these kind of soft power battles playing out. And there have been all kinds of examples in recent years of how Chinese money is changing the content of the films that we ourselves watch in the States and everywhere else. You know, we're seeing much more Chinese, many more Chinese faces and Chinese references in various ways in films. I mean, some of the examples that I've seen is in Iron Man 3, they actually inserted extra scenes for the Chinese market with Fan Bingbing, who's a very famous Chinese actress. And that was, you know, purely to get the film out there. But I think in other films, in The Martian, it's a Chinese space agency that swoops in to save the day. And in the recent Doctor Strange movie, you saw content being removed in the original comic, because it's a Marvel movie. One of the characters was supposed to be a Tibetan man, but when the film was made, Tibetan man became Tilda Swinton, who was a Celtic mystic, because China doesn't like, you know, any kind of depictions of Tibet potentially sensitive and difficult for China, so it's much easier to just kind of get rid of that altogether. So I think we are seeing Chinese influence there as well.
I have to say, I mean, just in agreement, it's also the case that when you think about Chinese art, music, popular culture that has had influence abroad, it's often, the perception is that it is in opposition to the government. And it's often because what we consume in the United States, for example, are things that have been heavily censored in China, including movies as well as some contemporary artists. So in a sense, the government handicaps its soft power by restricting the production of its own art and culture domestically, as with the recent ban on hip hop and rap.
Add, it takes the mic a little while to wake up. Just to add that, so I think in some ways the Chinese film industry is also evolving. So there've been lots of cases of successes, even with total flops in America, where they've done quite well in China. China's efforts to make a mega hit over here and try to influence Americans has been pretty poor, really. The Great Wall was their biggest attempt for a blockbuster, which was Matt Damon and very famous Chinese director Zhang Yimou, who designed all of the settings for the Olympics in 2008. They just did really poorly. So they've sort of, the latest sort of permutation is to try to learn from the U.S., to learn the special effects, all the mechanics of, and a good tearjerker story or whatever, and then just play that big for the Chinese audience and try to keep the Americans a little further out with really good Chinese content. And there's a film that's kind of a Rambo equivalent that's been hugely successful called Wolf Warrior, in which there's a civil war in Africa and the PLA special forces run to Africa, save the Africans, and then the American embassy is closed because they couldn't be bothered. And at the end, he the arrogant American says, you know, you kind of people will always be that way. And he goes, that's F-bomb history now. And the final thing on the very last scene says, basically, strong the message. A strong motherland will always have your back. And that's how the film ends.
So I think we're officially out of time, so we will end with that great soft power quote. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Have you seen it? No, I haven't seen it either. I've read the review.
What a note to end on. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Professor Mary Gallagher, to Mark Monnier, Louisa Lim, and Dio Ayatan. And I just want to say, this is our final public event of the academic year, and I love this because these are our Knight Wallace Fellows. And I stand up here at our event and I say, I'm Lynette Clements and I'm director of Wallace House, and we have this thing called the Knight Wallace Fellowship. And most of the time, the fellows aren't participating to this extent in the conversation because we brought some sort of guest. But we bring these groups of fellows to the university every year. And this level of intellect and the depth of this conversation we have every day at Wallace House. And it is thrilling for me to be able to share some of what makes our program so special with you. And to the extent that you're able to engage with Knight Wallace Fellows around campus, please do. We bring exceptional journalists from all over the world here every year. And again, thank you to Charles Eisendrath, who made this an essential, immovable part of our DNA. Thank you. And I said this is the last public event of this year, but take out your phones and mark your calendars, and we will see you on September 18th for our first event of the next academic year. We end every year with the Eisendrath Symposium. We start every academic year honoring another director, Graham Hovey, with a lecture called the Hovey Lecture, where we invite a former fellow back to give a talk that reflects the work that they did while they were here as a fellow and ties into current news. Our Hovey speaker on September 18th is a former fellow, Bernice Young, who works for Reveal and the Center for Investigative Reporting. And Bernice was reporting on the Me Too movement before that hashtag and reporting about abuse of working women with 2 investigative series, one called Rape in the Fields, one called Rape on the Night Shift. She has a book that just came out this week called In a Day's Work that is being reviewed very well. She will be coming to talk about this issue with us to start our academic year off next year, and we hope to see you at future Wallace House events. Thank you.